Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 7 cheat sheet. If you've never watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively an FPL guide through all the positions in FPL. We're looking at different price points, ranking players based on their sort of price points, and then actually factoring the fixtures, not the next three, but actually medium to long term as well, with a little bit less importance, then factoring in historical data, as well as some of the current season data. Now, interestingly, we are entering a period of games where I would say Liverpool and Arsenal have one good game here in Game Week 7, and then maybe a few mediocre ones just because of some of the mirror matchups. And then actually Game Week 10, there seems to be a bit of a fixture swing there. And Game Week 12, there's generally a fixture swing. So that's what I think the wider community is kind of looking at. We also have an international break here between 7 and 8. So after Game Week 7, we will have a bit of a pause on FPL action. So that could be, of course, one of the times to consider whether there's a change in landscape due to injuries and so on and so forth. In the midfield position, though, I would say the big meta shift is that, unfortunately, with less comfort in players below the price point of, let's say, Foden, and then between the price point of the likes of Rodgers and Semenyo at that sort of 5.x spot, there's only really Mbeumo who I would say is arguably essential, or someone that most people would like to have in their teams. Otherwise, there's a lot of optionality, and some people actually have decided to really move towards the budget mids and then actually stretch all the way towards the likes of Foden and above because they have less comfort in some of the players below Foden's price point. So that for me is the big dramatic shift. I'd also argue that this is potentially a time where you're considering what premiums you really want to go for, right? Whether you want to be set into, let's say, a structure that allows you to move in between players like Saka, Son, Palmer, Foden, or if you only have one of those spots available to your team and you actually have a little bit more depth in some of the other positions, like the forward position or the defender position. So that's the meta shift that I think I've noticed recently within teams that look like they can do well for the future. In the budget positions, though, really here I've collapsed the tier between, let's say, Dibbling and maybe up towards Smith Rowe at that 5.8 million price point, because ultimately I would say that a lot of these players should be considered together. Right now, I really like Rodgers, Carvalho, Semenyo, and McNeil. Semenyo is a pick that does carry some issues, though, right? 8, 9, and 10 are really, really poor fixtures for Bournemouth. So when you go for a Semenyo, you know, he's still very strong because I think he actually seems like the type of pick that could be a season keeper, but you do need rotation in the interim. With players like Rodgers, Carvalho, McNeil, really good fixtures here in Game Week 7. Generally speaking, Brentford have really good games. Same with Everton as well. And then with Rodgers, I'd argue some of the fixtures are a little bit tougher further down the line, but he actually seems like someone who's permanently playing for a much stronger team, right? An Aston Villa offense that still look very, very strong. So that's why I quite like Rodgers. As far as players like, let's say, Dibbling, Mavididi, these are more players that I would go for when the fixture run is right, and I'd be a little bit more confident in them. I think if I was a little bit more assured about Steve Cooper and whether he would be prone to, let's say, rotating Mavididi, just like he did at the start of the season, when Mavididi could easily start of the season potentially as the left wing or even arguably as the 10, which he did play in the preseason, I'd have a bit more comfort putting Mavididi right now as a green pick, because actually Leicester, their great run of games starts now. So Mavididi is definitely one of those picks. If you have the confidence in his minutes, I think he's a very, very good pick, and I think I'd keep him. Carvalho and McNeil seem to be benefiting from ultimately the injuries at their club, more so for Carvalho. For McNeil, he's a bit of a nailed player right now, right? He's playing 89 to 95 minutes a game. He's a set piece taker. The reason why I prefer him over someone like NDIA ultimately is the sort of FPL point gaining attributes, like being a set piece taker. And ultimately, his underlying stats this season have looked really impressive, and he's been probably one of Everton's bright sparks. Dibbling's minutes are still a little bit insecure, but you still know that he's a 4.6 player. So he is a little bit different to the rest. And Carvalho, ultimately, I think a lot of people have actually gone triple Brentford, maybe because of Fleck and Valdemarsson. But if you can actually maybe save a spot for him in your team, he could be one of those great enablers within the game, just given that Brentford actually have a really good run of fixtures. With, let's say, the likes of the 6.x tier, just moving on quickly to that. The reason why we don't have any green players goes back to the point where I think a lot of the players here are very strong, but I'm not sure if I would say that they're absolutely green picks. And that's because I would say the Spurs fixture run truly starts next week, although we're starting to see that Brighton look extremely frail and definitely a team that you can target on defense, particularly with Van Heck now confirmed out for a month. Savinho, his minutes will probably still struggle. We've seen a lot of rotation, different tactical structures where he will not have the minutes that we really want. So I think he has to drop. With Trossard and Martinelli, they play some really great fixtures over the next 2 game weeks, but after that, it becomes a little bit worse. So I think those are more short-term picks, definitely, where if you're looking for an immediate transfer, actually, Trossard and Martinelli might appeal to you as a green pick, but I wouldn't say that they are absolutely nailed for the foreseeable, because we know that players like Marino will get more minutes within the team. So far, it seems like Arsenal are almost playing with a 2 up top, almost a 4-4-2 of sorts with a low block. And maybe Marino is a bit more of a substitute for the central mids that they have. But Trossard right now, I think he's enjoying much better minutes because of the absence of Odegaard, and he's really thrived there. As far as Martinelli, it seems like also generally with a little bit more partnership going down that sort of left-hand side, he's also been benefiting, generally speaking. So these are both picks that I think are very strong for the short term. Kulusevski and Johnson are quite different players. Kulu definitely much more creative, Johnson much more of a goal threat. And when you look at their underlying stats, I think you have to apply that sort of context into it. Kulu plays more minutes per game, Johnson plays less minutes per game, so the per 90s are a little bit skewed. Tottenham have also had 2 really great games, and one of them was actually versus a 10-man United, so that kind of skews a lot of the XGI from and some of the production of the players like Kulusevski. But generally, I would still prefer Johnson because of the goal threat over Kulusevski. The thing I like about Kulusevski, though, is his minutes. The minutes look really good for him so far, and he does seem like one of the key players right now for the team. And of course, he's at an exclusive price point as well. As far as the 7-point-X tier, there aren't too many changes, unfortunately. I would say Gordon gets a rise, and I skipped over Eze, but I would say Eze gets a drop simply because of the Liverpool fixture, and the Nottingham Forest away isn't great. So that pair of fixtures isn't lovely. Whereas in the meantime, although the Gordon fixtures aren't amazing, he is definitely the only Newcastle player that I would recommend during the absence of Isak, because even though a lot of us like to mention how when you take a player out of the team, arguably the team gets worse, right? And that means, taking away a center forward, he's actually someone who definitely benefits more so than, let's say, Newcastle get affected negatively overall without Alexander Isak being the team, because he gets to play in more central positions. He's on pens 100% of the time, and we know his minutes are really good. So that's why I really like Gordon in the interim. Bowen, Madison, still some really good picks to go for, but would I say that they're absolutely lethal picks that a lot of us would consider? Not necessarily, because I think the reason why I haven't put all the Spurs players in the green tier is because I do think that ultimately holding up for maybe a defender plus a Solanke plus Son is the ideal way to go about triple Spurs. And maybe you're actually comfortable not going for, let's say, one of the defenders, or maybe you're not going to go for Son. And in that case, it makes a lot more sense for you to actually go for some of the more cheaply priced Spurs midfielders. But I do like leaving that room for Son because I still think he is one of the better picks to go for. And I'm still pretty certain that he's on penalties for Tottenham. But I could be wrong on that bet, and Solanke could even be better as a player as a result. In the meantime, Luis Diaz and Bruno do get drops. Bruno's appeal was successful, and he is now ready to play the next 3 games. I can give you some context myself. I don't have Bruno on my team anymore. You'll see that in the team selection later this week, because as I mentioned, the transfer plans, I was considering transfers out of Bruno, and to capture price rises, I moved out of Bruno preemptively. Probably a bad decision, but that's that. This is Bruno's worst game out of a really good run of games for United, but they're still playing some really poor football, and ultimately Bruno gets a drop. Luis Diaz is someone who also gets a drop, and part of that is because I do think that there's a pretty significant chance that someone like Gakpo could play and start on the weekend, and ultimately with Chelsea and Arsenal in back-to-back games, it's not exactly the best run of games for Luis Diaz, and you're starting to see, of course, over the last few weeks, Jota, Nunez rotation. Jota also slightly injured, it seems like, with a small injury, but he still played 30 minutes of the Champions League game. Luis Diaz actually was subbed off at 72 minutes. So there's also the case that he can play another 17 minutes for Crystal Palace away. But I generally still think that I'd probably go for some of the other picks over him in the meantime, which is why he drops. As far as players like Foden, he actually gets a significant rise. Foden has been someone who's been yo-yoing on the cheat sheet because it's been really hard to guess his minutes due to the sort of unforeseen injury a couple of weeks back. And then actually, ultimately, seemingly some personal issues that Pep has already intonated about, and I think some reporting has already been done on this. But generally speaking, he, found his goal tally in the Champions League. It seems like Gundo isn't playing his absolute best football, although he played quite well in the Champions League, and therefore, with Bernardo being rested, I suppose in the weekend, what we could see is something like Bernardo plus Foden, or maybe even Bernardo playing over someone like Savio potentially. What I do expect, though, is that Foden's minutes in the short term to be still very strong, and ultimately this three-piece run of games for Man City is incredible. I think even when you compare it to, let's say, Arsenal's run of next 3 games, it's much better. So that's how good the run of games is, which is why Foden in the interim definitely gets this rise. And part of this is that I'm anticipating a lot of managers actually have the room to move into Foden, and he becomes a very exciting punt. As far as Son, he's also someone who's just going to be a green pick as long as he's fit to play. If he's not fit to play, obviously just consider him later. But game week 8, as I said, is that Spurs fixture run and when that really starts. So I don't really mind holding off on a Son transfer up until the game week instead. As far as Palmer and Saka, these are players who still have amazing fixtures this game week. So that's why they're still green picks. Palmer is about to run into a sea of pretty tough games after game week 8 and including game week 8. But a lot of people will want to revisit someone like Palmer in game week 12. He's also someone who has absolutely insane underlying stats so far and what looks to be really good minutes, with exception to that one-time substitution versus West Ham. We know he's not participating in Europe, and I think that has a huge knock-on impact on his minutes compared to some of his peers within this price point and this sort of tier. Salah gets a small interim drop, and part of this is because I just think that at this price point, you do want someone at Salah's price to be a captaincy option for most game weeks. And after game week 6 has come and gone, and he was a great captaincy option for the Wolves game, I would say that for, let's say, 7, 8, 9, I don't really see them necessarily as weeks to captain Salah compared to some of the other midfielders we have, and specifically compared to Erling Haaland, which is why I think within that sort of meta shift, I have dropped Salah preemptively here on this game week. As far as the forward position, moving over to that, we have a significant entry here in Liam Delap. There is some doubt as to who takes penalties for Ipswich, but his minutes have actually slowly moved up and up and up in the same way that Evan Nilsson's has. But he played 81 over the weekend, scored an amazing brace. Underlying stats are still a little bit subpar, and I think we do sort of expect that from a player playing for a much weaker team. It's very hard to actually amass really good goal numbers, but with good minutes, with potential penalty share, with actually a really good run of games in the short term, I think Liam Delap is actually a really good option at his price point. With Vardy, you can make the same argument with his good short run of games, coming off of the Liverpool fixture now, or coming off rather, sorry, of the Arsenal fixture. It's just generally a good time to own someone like Vardy, and he does compete very well against, let's say, the likes of Calvert-Lewin and Chris Wood. As far as João Pedro, he gets a drop. It seems like he wasn't even pictured within training. So I'm sure, of course, if you own someone like João Pedro now, you could consider selling him as well. Definitely one player to revisit when he's fit, but no reason to even mess about with him or consider him until he's back fully fit, because we also know that Fabian takes a pretty, I would say, cautious approach to bringing players back in from injury, right? It might be the case that he will play reduced minutes like we saw, for example, when he was reintroduced versus Nottingham Forest and also missed the game previous to that. So that's probably what we're expecting. In the interim, of course, Welbeck becomes a penalty taker, so he's a very good pick. And then Evan Nilsson has a good Leicester fixture, but then once again, similar to Semenyo, has 3 poor fixtures after that. Jimenez has been added to the cheat sheet. I do think he's a very strong pick as long as he continues to start over Muniz, but I would still have to say that the fixtures for Fulham are not good enough for me to say that Jimenez is someone that we should be transferring into. Yes, of course, he's on 1 goal per game. But is that sustainable? That's not really something that I would expect. The underlying stats are also not suggesting anything of the sort either. So that's why Jimenez is sort of where he's at. Strand Larson also drops. I just think without pen share and now some slightly earlier substitutions, he's really not the pick that I would go for, and he isn't that enticing whatsoever. As far as Nketiah, similar situation there. In the 6.x tier, I've given Duran a drop even after he scored an absolute worldie versus Bayern Munich that I had the pleasure to watch. And of course, another crowning moment. But unfortunately, of course, if he's going to play 30 minutes per game, he's probably not going to be a serious FPL option until he finally gets starts. And I will not upgrade him on the cheat sheet until that happens. And that's just that. As far as the other price points, I've given Mateta and Isak drops. Mateta mostly because the next 2 fixtures aren't great for Crystal Palace. Even though he's got a bit of pen share, we've seen some early substitutions as well. Underlying stats are generally very, very poor. So when you look at, for example, all the forwards here within all these price points, only arguably, let's say even someone like Calvert-Lewin has slightly better underlying stats than him. And that says a lot because Calvert-Lewin plays a lot more minutes of football. So not exactly a great look for Mateta. As far as Isak, unfortunately, the injury just means that he drops. Havertz, Watkins, Haaland. We actually have a lot of depth around the forward positions. And I think once again, it comes back down to questions of structure and what you want to have for your team and how you plan to play FPL over the next few game weeks. A lot of these players within the green tier are all very much viable. Players in the Delap, Vardy, Calvert-Lewin, Wood tier can be, for example, doubled up. You can also just go for the 1 player. You can also go for a 4.5, which allows you to accommodate for much more stronger picks within the midfield and their defense, and I think that's viable too. But there's nothing to say that these forwards are weak. We have really good fixtures for Slanky over arguably the next 5. For someone like Jackson, still a good run of games for Chelsea. At least after game week 7, that's probably where I'm going to drop someone like Jackson. But if you, let's say, consider just the next 3 fixtures, 2 out of 3 are really, really good for Jackson. So maybe, of course, you can consider selling him a little bit later, but I'd still definitely keep him for game week 7, even though arguably he'll probably drop next week as we move ahead. As far as the defense, shifting over gears towards that, the defense is an interesting tier where Vandenberg has been added, because last week we actually saw him play right back for Brentford, and I was sort of cautious on moving towards Vandenberg into the cheat sheet because I wasn't quite sure if he was nailed for the team. It seems like because of the amount of injuries that they have, with Rico Henry not being close to playing competitive football anytime soon, and I'm sure that rehabilitation process will take some time, that Vandenberg's just going to get really good minutes, especially if he's going to be able to play right back, and then of course that sort of 5-back structure that they have where he's clearly playing alongside Collins and Pinnock. So he's going to benefit greatly from that. The interim fixtures for Brentford are really good. Do I prefer him over Greaves? Yes, I do. In terms of the next tier, Mykolenko rises towards the top. The run of fixtures for Everton is really good, and now he's finally back fit, so I can actually give him a rise on the cheat sheet. Would I spend the money to go towards someone like Branthwaite? I absolutely would not, but Mykolenko is definitely a solid, strong pick. Aina, still someone who actually, is a fullback, someone I would still prefer over the likes of Milenkovic or even Sells. So I still think he's great because ultimately Nottingham Forest have looked like a strong defensive team. There are going to be bad fixtures, right? Chelsea away, in my opinion, is a very bad fixture. So a lot of these 4.5s, once again, are players that you want to play at the opportune time. So even though, for example, Mykolenko seems like someone you can play every game week, and that's possible, I would not play someone like Aina versus Chelsea away. And the same applies to, let's say, Colwell versus Liverpool away, right? So that's why, even though some of these players are in the green tier, just take into account that you can't play them every game unless they actually just have a great run of fixtures like Mykolenko or like even Van de Ven over the next 5. So Van de Ven gets a rise as well. Leif Davis also arguably has a really good fixture run. And then Rico Lewis, still the gem, I would say the hidden gem in terms of his performance his performances so far and the lack of clean sheet so far have probably undersold how good he is potentially as a pick. Some people might not really, I guess, believe that aspect towards Lewis, but I would say within a tier here in the 4.5s where you see very minimal production from the offensive point of view, it's really only Leif Davis and Rico Lewis who excite here. And Lewis particularly because ultimately with better fixtures, Man City should be getting clean sheets even without Rodri. And that's sort of my assessment of things. Konsa gets a drop because the interim fixtures are getting a little bit worse. Van Heck also has been unfortunately taken out of the cheat sheet, but you still have Dunk here. Clearly, Brighton will struggle without him, but I don't think that Brighton will be that much worse when the fixtures get better. And there will still be fixtures, for example, like game week 9, where you can definitely play someone like Dunk versus Wolves at home. So it's not like every single fixture for Brighton in the future is poor. It's just that the general run of games is poor. But Dunk is someone that you can keep in your team as your 4/5th defender. In terms of the other price points, no real changes there. I would say Guecki gets a small drop because the Crystal Palace fixtures are a bit worse. And generally across the board, the underlying stats so far have not really excited too much. And then when we move towards, let's say, the likes of Konate, still at the prime there at the 5.x position. Dallo and De Ligt get a drop. I just still have not been too impressed with United overall. There's a bit of a yo-yo effect here, I think, with United, where ultimately after game week 8, there's a good run of games, generally speaking. So it really comes down to whether you would like to own United players over that run. It's up to you. I do think the run is actually generally quite good. With Cucurella, we're seeing slightly early substitutions. He's also pretty high in terms of yellow cards so far this season. And generally speaking, I still don't see any value towards going for him over, like, let's say, Colwell. In the 5.5 tier, I still have a lot of confidence in Porro. And part of this is going back to the Spurs piece with Van de Ven. Their underlying stats look really good. Their defense looks much better. Their set piece defense also looks much better. So even though, yes, of course, they conceded versus Gabriel, which I think is honestly any team can concede to Gabriel, as Man City shown. Porro seems like a pick who maybe arguably with Kulusevski's more prominent role within the team and Johnson's role within the team isn't taking as many shots. But I also think that starting the season, of course, taking 7 shots, for example, versus Newcastle, that's not normal. So I think we don't need to normalize necessarily how exciting Porro could be as a pick. And ultimately, the run of games is so good, I still think he's going to get a lot of value. He still, even, for example, within the United game, was getting shots on target. So this is a very strong defender still that I think we should not be underrating from that aspect. Akanji is still a very strong pick. I think he's actually one of the nailed City players over the course of the season, someone who has been able to stay fit compared to the likes of Stones and Ake at the same time as well. Doesn't really need to be rested as much as Diaz. And alongside Guardiola, I think are probably two of the most nailed defenders. Rico's a little bit of a hybrid, I would say, and he's been playing amazing. So those are the three City picks that I would still rate very much highly within defense. Calafiori gets a sort of introduction to the cheat sheet, and Timber has been preemptively taken out. But there's a bit of pause with Timber here because, of course, he might actually play within the weekend. He was subbed off at 45 minutes versus PSG, but he could still play. We also have some doubts around Ben White. Calafiori, though, still seems like he's fit. And honestly, seems like he has a lot of attacking threat to him as a player, which makes him very exciting. No other changes really in the cheat sheet. We have a small Trent drop, and part of that, as I said, is just contextualizing the Liverpool fixtures being a little bit worse. And I think because he's such a premium player at such a premium price point, whilst Robertson is still green, because I think Robertson will get most of the Prem games, part of this is just me saying that I think within the meta of the game, I would probably prefer not owning Trent for now and spending more money within other positions where needs sort of require, like in the midfield, where, as I said, there's a lack of depth within certain positions. People want to push up to those sort of sub-premium picks, and that's what sort of losing Trent within your team, I think, will allow you to do. I might be wrong. Trent is still one of the absolute best players in the game, and we know he's obviously capable of producing absolute madness, but that's how I've sort of assessed things here. In the goalkeeping position, no real changes other than the Verbruggen drop to mostly reflect the Van Heck change. Hermansen has been added just because he just seems like potentially the best shot stopper within the league. And I think when called upon, of course, he'll have to do a lot of that this season compared to, let's say, someone who probably might be the best shot stopper in the league, like Alisson. As far as Areola, he gets a rise because the run of fixtures for West Ham are getting much better. As far as Martinez, he does get a bit of a drop because unfortunately the fixtures for Aston Villa are turning a little bit worse, even though actually Aston Villa have looked really good so far. In fact, ironically, they've kept a clean sheet versus Bayern Munich. So that's going to be the cheat sheet for now. No significant changes this week, I would say, other than a lot of movement within the midfield position where you now have the choice with, let's say, Arsenal players, Tottenham players, and then what you want to do around some of those budget or premium players. So thank you so much for watching the cheat sheet. Hope you guys enjoyed the video this week. See you guys in the next video. Take care and goodbye.